For 6 years, my in-laws told me my husband died without a will, that everything he owned rightfully passed to them. I believed it because grief makes you believe things. Then I brought an old estate document to my credit union and the teller paused. She stared at the notary stamp, then looked up at me. "This notary retired in 2015, she said. "This document is dated 3 years later. It's a forgery." And just like that, the story my in-laws built started to crack. My name is Nancy, and the document the teller was holding was one my husband David had supposedly signed before he died. His parents, Richard and Barbara, swore no will existed. But if that was true, what was this piece of paper and who had forged it? I was about to find out. David and I met in college. He was studying architecture, I was finishing my nursing degree. He had this quiet confidence, the kind that made you feel safe without him ever having to say a word. We married in June of 2014, a small ceremony at a vineyard his parents insisted on paying for. Richard and Barbara were charming when they wanted to be, generous in ways that came with invisible strings. I learned that slowly. David's father ran a commercial real estate firm. His mother served on 3 nonprofit boards. They lived in a restored Victorian with a wine cellar and a guest house. From the outside, they looked like the perfect family, but David kept them at arm's length. He once told me, "My parents love leverage. They don't give gifts, they make investments." I didn't fully understand what he meant until after he was gone. It happened on a Tuesday. October 17th, 2017. A delivery truck ran a red light at an intersection David drove through every morning on his way to the firm where he worked. The impact killed him instantly. I got the call at 10:42 a.m. while I was changing an IV bag on the 3rd floor of Mercy General. I remember the exact time because the clock on the wall stopped meaning anything after that. Richard and Barbara arrived within hours. They handled the funeral arrangements, the insurance calls, the paperwork. While I sat on the couch in a fog, barely able to speak, they moved through my house like executives closing a merger. At the time, it felt like mercy. I couldn't think. I couldn't function, so I let them. 3 days after the funeral, Richard sat me down at the dining table. His voice was gentle, measured, the voice you use with someone fragile. "Nancy, we've spoken with David's attorney. There is no will. Under state law, his assets pass to us as his parents." I stared at him. No will. David was meticulous about everything. He organized bookshelves by genre and alphabetized our spice rack. The idea that he'd never drafted a will felt wrong, but grief has a way of silencing your instincts. I nodded. I didn't ask questions. Over the following weeks, the transfer happened with surgical efficiency. The house was in David's name, so Richard and Barbara sold it. They kept the proceeds. His savings, his investments, even his car, everything I thought we had built together, absorbed into a trust I wasn't part of. They offered to let me stay in the house for 60 days while I found an apartment. As if they were being kind, as if they hadn't just erased my life. I moved into a 1-bedroom rental on the east side of town. I went back to work. I tried to heal. The years passed slowly. I didn't date. I didn't fight. I just existed. But 6 years later, something changed. I was cleaning out a storage unit I'd kept since the move, boxes of David's things I'd never had the strength to open. One box was full of files from his home office. Tax returns, old contracts, a folder labeled estate documents. Inside, I found a single piece of paper. It was a last will and testament, dated March 2nd, 2018. Below David's signature was a notary stamp with the name Catherine Webb, commission number 8421, and an expiration date of January 2021. My hands shook. The will left everything to me, but Richard had told me no will existed. And the date was impossible. David died in 2017. How could a document bearing his signature be dated a full 6 months after his death? I called Richard the next morning. He dismissed it immediately. "Probably a draft he never finalized. It doesn't matter. The estate is closed." His tone was clipped, final, but I couldn't let it go. So I slipped the document into my bag and drove to my credit union, hoping someone there could tell me if the notary stamp was legitimate. I had no idea I was about to walk into the truth. The teller's name was Catherine Webb. She had been a notary for 17 years before retiring in 2015. She'd spent her career at this very credit union, stamping thousands of documents, verifying signatures for mortgages, powers of attorney, estate filings. She knew the state's notary requirements cold. She had too. A single mistake could invalidate a transaction worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I handed her the document casually, trying to keep my voice steady. Could you look at this notary stamp and tell me if it looks legitimate? She adjusted her glasses and tilted the page toward the light. Her expression shifted in stages. First curiosity, then confusion, then something sharper. She pointed to the name on the stamp. Catherine Webb, my Catherine Webb. That's my name, she said. And that's my old commission number. But I retired in 2015. I surrendered my stamp and my journal to the county that same year. This document is dated March of 2018. I could not have notarized this. I felt the floor drop. So this stamp is a forgery. Catherine nodded slowly, her face grave. Someone copied my seal. They might have found an old document I notarized and scanned the impression. It's not hard to do, but it is a felony. She handed the document back to me like it was evidence, because it was. I drove home with the document on the passenger seat, my mind racing. If the notary stamp was forged, then the entire will was fabricated, which meant someone created a fake document to make it look like David had signed away his estate. But who? And why now, 6 years after his death? The answer came faster than I expected. 3 days later, I received a letter from a law firm representing Richard and Barbara. The letter stated that the estate of David was being reviewed for administrative closure irregularities, and that any documents I possessed related to the estate should be surrendered immediately. They didn't mention the will specifically. They didn't have to. Someone had gotten nervous. I called a probate attorney that afternoon. Her name was Elaine Machetti. She specialized in estate litigation and had seen just about every form of inheritance fraud imaginable. When I told her about the forged notary stamp, she didn't sound surprised. She sounded tired. Notary forgery is more common than people think, she said. The problem is proving who did it. Most families don't want to believe a relative would commit fraud, so cases like yours rarely get investigated. But I wasn't most families. I had been erased from my husband's life. I had lost our home, our savings, and 6 years of my future. If someone had forged a document to steal what David wanted me to have, I was going to find out who, even if it meant tearing through every file, every record, every lie. Elaine filed a motion to reopen probate. The court granted it on grounds of newly discovered evidence of fraud. Within 2 weeks, Richard and Barbara were served with subpoenas. Their response was immediate. They countersued me for defamation, claiming I was a grieving widow who had fabricated a conspiracy to extort money from a respectable family. Their lawyer called me unstable in the filing. The same lawyer who, 6 years earlier, had assured me there was no will. But here's what they didn't know. After Catherine identified the forged stamp, I started digging. I requested every document the probate court had on file for David's estate. What I found made my blood run cold. The original probate filing included a sworn affidavit from Richard, signed under penalty of perjury, stating that he had conducted a diligent search for any will and found none. He swore it, under oath, with a notary's stamp right beneath his signature. I cross-referenced the date on Richard's affidavit with the date on the forged will. They were filed 6 weeks apart, but the notary on Richard's affidavit was the same Catherine Webb, the real Catherine Webb, before she retired. Before the forged stamp appeared, someone had used her legitimate notarization of Richard's affidavit to copy her seal and commission number, which meant the forger had access to the original probate filing, that Richard had submitted. I called Elaine immediately. Richard didn't just lie about the will, I said. He provided the source material for the forgery. Knowingly or unknowingly, his affidavit is connected to the fake document. Elaine was silent for a moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. If Richard knew the will was forged and used probate to enforce it, we're not talking about a civil dispute anymore. We're talking about criminal conspiracy. That night, I sat in my apartment and spread every document across my kitchen table. The forged will, Richard's affidavit, the probate court's original order closing the estate, bank statements showing the liquidation of David's accounts, the deed to our house, transferred to Richard and Barbara. I traced the timeline with my finger. October, David dies intestate. November, Richard swears there's no will. December, probate closes. All the assets transfer. But someone, months later, created a fake will with my name on it. Why? The answer clicked into place at 2:00 a.m. The fake will wasn't the crime. The fake will was the cover-up. Someone had discovered that David did have a real will, a will that left everything to me. And to prevent it from ever surfacing, they fabricated a clumsy forgery, a decoy, something that could be dismissed as a draft or a hoax if anyone ever went looking. The real will was still out there, And I knew exactly who had hidden it. I knew exactly who had hidden it. Richard and Barbara had built their entire post-David world on the premise that no will existed. They had absorbed his assets, sold the house, redirected every cent of his life's work into accounts they controlled. If a real will surfaced, everything they'd taken would have to be returned. Every dollar, every property, every investment. So they buried it. But David was not the kind of man who made only one copy of anything. He backed up his files. He kept duplicates. He planned for exactly the kind of people his parents were. I just had to figure out where he'd put the backup. I started with the one person David trusted completely. His attorney, Frank DiMaggio. Frank had been David's lawyer since he opened his first architecture firm at 28. Richard and Barbara told me after the funeral that Frank was unreachable, that he had retired to a small town in Maine and didn't return calls. They suggested I not waste my time. I believed them because they said it with such casual authority, the way they said everything, and I was too broken to question it. 6 years later, I opened my laptop and typed Frank DiMaggio into a search bar. He wasn't unreachable. He was in the same city, still practicing law, still listed in the state bar directory with a current phone number. Richard and Barbara had lied about that too. I called the number. Frank answered on the second ring. "Nancy." His voice broke when he realized who it was. "I've been waiting 6 years for this call." Frank told me everything. David had drafted a will in early 2017, months before the accident. It was witnessed, notarized by a legitimate notary, and filed with Frank's office. David had left everything to me. The house, the savings, the investment portfolio, all of it. But Richard and Barbara had gotten to Frank first. Within a week of David's death, they showed up at his office. They didn't threaten him directly. They were too smart for that. They offered him a consulting fee of $50,000 to close the estate without the will. When Frank refused, they told him they would drag him through so much litigation, so many bar complaints, so many fabricated ethics violations that his career would be over before a single court date was even set. Frank was 67 years old. He had a small practice and a wife with chronic health issues. He couldn't afford a war with people who had unlimited resources and zero moral boundaries. So he did something he would regret for years. He gave them the original will and the copy in his possession. He told himself he'd figure out another way to get it to me. But before he could, Richard and Barbara filed the probate paperwork stating no will existed, and the court closed the case in 3 months. Frank never spoke up. He'd been carrying the guilt ever since. But here's the twist. Frank didn't give them everything. He kept one copy of the will in a safety deposit box that neither Richard nor Barbara knew existed. He also kept something else. A sealed letter David had written specifically for me, with instructions that it be delivered only if his parents ever tried to contest or suppress his estate plans. David knew exactly who his parents were, and he had planned for this moment years before it happened. I met Frank at his office the following morning. He handed me a manila envelope with trembling hands. Inside was the real will, clean and properly notarized with the stamp of a legitimate notary whose commission was still valid. And behind it, a letter in David's handwriting. I didn't open it yet. I couldn't. Not in that office, not with Frank watching me. I thanked him and I drove straight to Elaine Machetti's office. Elaine reviewed the documents with the precision of a surgeon. "This changes everything," she said. "We have the original will, properly executed and witnessed. We have proof Richard and Barbara suppressed it. We have a witness in Frank who can testify to their intimidation. And we have evidence that they filed a false oath with the probate court. They swore no will existed when they knew full well one did. That's perjury." But the real revelation was in David's letter. I read it that night, alone in my apartment, with the blinds closed and the phone off. It was 7 pages long. He wrote about his parents' pattern of financial control, how they had leveraged money to manipulate family members for decades. He wrote about his cousin who had been cut out of a trust for marrying someone Richard didn't approve of. He wrote about the business deal his father had sabotaged to keep a younger partner from gaining too much independence. And he wrote about me. "You are the first person I've ever loved who wasn't trying to buy me or sell me," he said. "My parents will try to erase you when I'm gone. Don't let them. Everything I have is yours, not theirs. Yours." By the time I finished reading, I wasn't crying. I was furious. Not just for myself, but for David. He had lived his whole life under their thumb, and even in death, he'd had to protect himself from them. The next morning, Elaine filed an emergency motion with the probate court. She attached the real will, Frank's sworn affidavit, and a copy of the forged document with the fake notary stamp. She argued that Richard and Barbara had committed multiple felonies, including perjury, fraud, and will suppression. The judge issued an order to show cause. Richard and Barbara had 30 days to explain why they should not be held in contempt of court and ordered to return every asset they had taken. That's when the story went from explosive to nuclear. While reviewing the financial records tied to David's estate, Elaine discovered something I had been too numb to notice 6 years ago. Richard hadn't just taken the house and the savings. He had liquidated David's investment portfolio, valued at just over $400,000. He had done it 4 weeks after David's death, before probate had even formally closed. The liquidation was processed through a subsidiary of Richard's commercial real estate firm, disguised as a business expense. It was money laundering, plain and simple. I sat in Elaine's office as she laid out the timeline on a legal pad. "The forgery was a panic move," she said. "My guess is that someone tipped Richard off that you were asking questions about the estate. Maybe Catherine's identification of the fake notary stamp got back to him somehow. So he and Barbara tried to plant a crude forgery to make it look like any will that surfaced was fraudulent. They didn't count on you finding the real one. And they definitely didn't count on Frank keeping a copy." The walls were closing in. The local district attorney's office had already been contacted about the forged notary stamp. Now they were looking at perjury and financial fraud. Richard's real estate licenses were at risk. Barbara's nonprofit board seats were suddenly in jeopardy. For people who had built their entire lives on reputation and control, this was the worst possible outcome. And we were just getting started. The show cause hearing took place on a Thursday morning in late September. The courtroom was small and cold, the kind of room where decades of family secrets had been aired under fluorescent light. Richard and Barbara arrived in matching Navy suits, their attorney a silver-haired man who charged more per hour than most people make in a day. They looked confident. They always did. Elaine and I sat at the plaintiff's table. In front of us, a stack of exhibits, the forged will with the fake notary stamp. The real will from Frank's safety deposit box. Richard's sworn affidavit claiming no will existed. Bank records showing the liquidation of David's investment portfolio 4 weeks after his death, funneled through a shell company Richard controlled. And the letter Frank wrote under oath, describing how Richard and Barbara had threatened to destroy his career if he didn't hand over the original documents. The judge read through everything in silence. When she looked up, her expression was unreadable. "Mr. and Mrs. Delacroix," she said, "you filed a sworn statement with this court claiming your son died intestate. Yet evidence now shows you were in possession of his valid will, which you obtained through intimidation of his attorney, and which you subsequently destroyed or concealed. Is that correct?" Richard's attorney began to object, but Richard cut him off. For the first time, his controlled mask slipped. "This is a misunderstanding. We were protecting our son's estate from a woman who married him for money." He pointed at me. "She's the one who produced a forged document. We did nothing wrong." The judge set down her pen. "The forged document you're referring to, Mr. Delacroix, was created using a notary stamp originally recorded on your own affidavit. The only person with access to that affidavit was you. Are you prepared to explain that under oath?" Richard didn't answer. His attorney whispered something in his ear. Barbara stared straight ahead, her face pale. After 3 hours of testimony, the judge ruled from the bench. The probate case was reopened. The original will was admitted as valid. David's estate, including all assets absorbed by Richard and Barbara, was to be fully restored and transferred to me within 60 days. Richard and Barbara were held in civil contempt for filing a false oath, and the court referred the matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation, perjury, fraud, and forgery. Every word landed like a gavel strike. Outside the courtroom, Richard walked past me without making eye contact, but Barbara stopped. She looked at me with something I'd never seen before, not anger, not guilt, something closer to disbelief. "You didn't have to do it this way," she said. "We would have taken care of you." "You took my home," I said. "You took 6 years I'll never get back. You took David's last words from me. You didn't take care of me. You erased me." She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in the entire ordeal, Barbara Delacroix had nothing to say. 3 months later, the criminal charges came down. Richard was indicted on 2 counts of perjury, one count of will suppression, and one count of financial fraud for the unauthorized liquidation of David's assets. Barbara was named as a co-conspirator in the fraud count. The forged notary stamp charge was added separately, elevating the case to a felony. Richard's real estate license was suspended pending the outcome. Barbara resigned from all 3 of her nonprofit boards within a week of the indictment becoming public. The financial restoration took longer. The house had been sold to a third party years ago, so I couldn't get it back. But the court ordered Richard to pay me the full market value at the time of sale, adjusted for appreciation, plus the $400,000 in liquidated investments, plus David's savings, plus interest. All told, it came to just under $900,000. Elaine called it a complete victory. I called it the price of a marriage cut in half. But the thing that mattered most was not the money. It was the letter. David's letter, 7 pages in his careful handwriting, written in 2017 when he was 32 years old and healthy and thinking about a future that included me. I read it at the cabin we had rented for our 5th anniversary, the one he loved because it had a view of the lake and no cell reception. I read it slowly, out loud, to the empty room. He told me he loved me. He told me he knew his parents would try to control his legacy. He told me to be strong, to trust Frank, to believe that I deserved everything he had. And then he wrote one line that I have memorized now, word for word. "You were the only family I ever chose. Don't let the family I was born into take that from you." I folded the letter and held it against my chest. Not as a widow grieving a man 6 years gone, but as a woman who had finally, completely, been given back the life she was supposed to have. Catherine Webb retired from the credit union in 2015, but she testified at Richard's trial as an expert witness on notary procedures. She explained how the forgery was done, how the seal was copied, how anyone with access to the original affidavit could have reproduced it. Her testimony was dry and technical, but the jury listened to every word. Richard was convicted on all counts in March. He was sentenced to 3 years in state prison. Barbara received probation and a fine, but the damage to her reputation was permanent. They lost their influence, their social standing, and any remaining claim to David's memory. Frank DiMaggio retired for real this time, but not before Elaine and I drafted a formal letter to the state bar explaining that he had been coerced. No charges were filed against him. He still sends me a Christmas card every year with a handwritten apology. I tell him there's nothing to apologize for. He kept the proof that saved me. I still live in the same apartment, but not for much longer. I used part of the settlement to buy a small house on the edge of town, nothing like the one David and I shared, but mine. All mine. The rest went into a trust, irrevocable, ironclad, with Elaine as the trustee. I learned from David's mistake. I learned from his parents' greed. I will never leave the people I love unprotected. And there's one final detail that still gives me chills when I think about it. After the trial, the district attorney's office returned the forged document to me as part of the evidence release. I was about to shred it when I noticed something I'd missed before. The fake notary stamp wasn't just copied from Richard's affidavit. It was copied from a specific page. Page 3, where Richard's signature appeared directly beneath the notary block. The forger had carefully positioned the fake stamp to sit in the exact same spot on the forged will. Which means someone had to physically place the affidavit against the forgery and align them. That's not a casual crime. That's deliberate. That's personal. I put the document in a frame and hung it on my wall, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Some families build you up. Others will spend decades trying to tear you down. But if you trust your instincts, if you keep asking questions, if you refuse to be erased, the truth will find its way to the surface. Sometimes it takes a bank teller with a sharp eye and a retired notary who remembers her own stamp. Sometimes it takes a letter your husband wrote years before he knew he'd need it. But it always comes out. I still think about what would have happened if I hadn't walked into that credit union. If Catherine hadn't been at the counter that day. If I had simply accepted the version of my life Richard and Barbara handed me and never questioned it. The truth is, most people don't question. Grief is exhausting. Trusting the people who step in to handle things feels like survival. And that's exactly what predators count on. David's parents didn't just steal assets. They stole my ability to mourn without suspicion. They turned every kind gesture into a potential manipulation. For years, I second-guessed everyone who tried to help me because I had learned, in the cruelest way, that the people closest to you can be the ones most willing to erase you. That kind of damage doesn't show up on a financial statement. It lives in your bones. But here's what I also learned. Documents matter. Paper trails matter. A single notary's memory can unravel a 6-year conspiracy. And the people who love you often plan for your protection long before you know you'll need it. David wrote me a letter in case he died. My grandparents, God rest them, created a trust for their granddaughter in a different story for the same reason. These acts of quiet foresight are the reason I'm standing here today. If you're listening to this and you have people you love, ask yourself a hard question. Have you put anything in writing? Not because you don't trust the people around you, but because you do love them enough to protect them from the people you can't predict. Wills aren't about death. They're about clarity. They're the last time you get to say, I chose you. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more stories that remind you the truth usually wins, just not always on time. And drop a comment below. Have you ever been told something about a loved one's estate that didn't sit right? Did you listen to that instinct or push it aside? I read the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Because sometimes the only person who will protect your legacy is you and the people who truly loved you. Don't let anyone take that from you.